So, today on the podcast, we continue our story about Disney legend Mary Blair, the person who many believed was Walt's favorite artist. But also, as with many people who were close to Walt, his passing slowly changed how the company related to them. In this episode, we begin to track the changes that moved through WED, through the Florida Project, later known as Disney World, and through Mary's personal and professional life. When we left off last time, we were looking at Walt's final days and also how Mary remained focused on her murals for New Tomorrowland after Walt passed away and the company began to enter a period of deep uncertainty. And that is exactly where we will pick up today, with the story of how Walt's older brother Roy tried to keep the company moving forward, even if that also led to deep changes for and questions about the project that Walt once wanted to build in the Sunshine State. Problems stemming from Walt's death radiated slowly through the company. At the time of Walt's passing, Roy had wanted to retire as he had recently turned 73 years old and had planned a retirement trip which clearly needed to be canceled. Following a period of mourning, Roy looked for an outside executive to take over management of Walt Disney Productions. Initially, he tried to convince the president of Bank of America and longtime Disney board member Clark Bees to take the reins, essentially occupying the roles that both he and Walt had held for decades. To move this process along, Roy and his wife Edna drove up to San Francisco to discuss the matter in person. But Bees turned down the offer. Bees, too, was looking forward to retirement. Without a defined company leader, movement on the Florida Project, aside from some early survey and design work, came to a halt. Roy questioned whether the company, without Walt, could successfully sell the new resort to corporate sponsors and the public. Without a new leader in place to unify Disney's overall direction, the company quietly fractured into a collection of fiefdoms, each focused on their own projects. Animators worked to finish The Jungle Book, which would be the first animated feature released without Walt. Producers arranged material for the 1967 version of the weekly Disney TV series, The Wonderful World of Color. WED, of course, focused on New Tomorrowland and, to a lesser extent, a possible ski resort the company might build in the Sierras. But the main focus was on Tomorrowland, as designers saw this as a way to complete one of Walt's last visions as a tribute to him. But no one at WED was confused as to how murky their future looked. They all understood the larger problems that circled them. Without the Florida Project, how many designers would WED need in the coming years? During winter and spring, Roy struggled to find a path forward, a path that would allow him to gracefully exit the company and finally ease into retirement. He explored various leadership possibilities with younger executives, such as Card Walker and Don Tatum, also family members such as Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller. But all the qualified executives Roy believed were too young to carry a company as large as Walt Disney Productions, especially if Disney moved forward with the Florida Project. When Walt passed away, Ron Miller explained, Roy called me over to his house and he said, it's not too late to turn back from Florida. We still have a big commitment ahead of ourselves. The two talked then about the practicality of the Florida Project without Walt, specifically without Walt's connections to potential in-park sponsors and representatives of American industry. We need family support, Roy said to Miller. Then he explained that bankers and investors needed to see that the family was unified before they could proceed with Florida. Can you speak for the family? Miller assured him that he could, but even after this conversation, Roy still did not know if the company should move into Florida, which increased the insecurity some WED employees felt about their future inside the company. During these months, Mary Blair focused on completing the twin murals for New Tomorrowland, a set of large-scale images that would be seen by millions of visitors to Disneyland each year. From its beginning, Disneyland had some formal connection to the world of fine art. For example, during the summer that Disneyland opened, Walt invited his art directors to exhibit their own paintings and drawings, largely materials that had been used for film production, in an exhibition space that the park had not been able to lease out to a sponsor. This had been, in essence, Disneyland's first art show, with credit given to the artist whose works were on exhibit. From there, Disneyland created an exhibition on the art of animation. They also displayed props used to create films. Many lands and attractions in Disneyland offered artful narrative or thematic experiences, including It's a Small World. Beyond this, Disneyland incorporated elements of the fine arts and crafts into its lands, such as arrangements of stained glass and the ornamental artwork used for the balconies in New Orleans Square. But none of these displays, at least in how fine art was largely defined in the 1960s, would be easily confused with the type of exhibits that one might find in traditional museums or galleries. Mary Blair's murals, however, clearly fell into the category of fine arts that expressed an individual vision. Her murals were both an artful display to visually enliven the park and also a presentation of her vision and skills similar to what might be considered for inclusion in a museum. Disney acknowledged that these murals were in a slightly different category than other artistic presentations that had been featured in the park. Whereas most Disney art was collaborative, at least in its final presentation as a film, land, or attraction, these murals offered a unique vision emanated from a singular artist. Beyond this, the murals were in a different category of presentation. Whereas most Disneyland experiences had strong ties to the traditions of outdoor amusements, even if they were elevated in terms of their visual presentation, these murals had stronger ties to the traditions of the fine arts. In essence, these murals were no different than what other fine artists were creating elsewhere in the U.S. as permanent or semi-permanent exhibits, with the finished art typically applied to a wall. This, again, would include noted artists such as Millard Sheets. In short, the nature of Mary's work here for Disneyland was different than that of It's a Small World. For Small World, Mary had adapted her designs and blended them with the designs of Rolly Crump to create a unique experience. But the primary identity of Small World was as a dark ride which spoke to the traditions of outdoor amusements. But here, Mary was creating art in a traditional medium, a ceramic presentation of her drawings and paintings that would be exhibited as traditional art inside of a theme park. As such, Disney allowed her to do something unusual in terms of her credit line. Something that had not been offered to previous artists who created permanent additions to Disneyland. She was allowed to sign her work. As Rolly Crump recalled, Mary was the only one to sign her work. The murals in Tomorrowland where she had this tile company build all those, she got to sign them. Her friend Alice Davis added that this was because Mary was seen as having a uniquely personal connection to the images she was now creating for the park. She was kind of the backbone for the color and a lot of things, Alice said. The mural exhibition would have one other unique element. It could be viewed from one of two locations. First, it could be viewed by guests walking from the hub into Tomorrowland, as the two murals would line the entrance corridor to this revised land. But second, guests could view it from a unique transportation system then being built at Disneyland called the People Mover. The People Mover used a conveyance system that Disney had developed for the Ford Magic Skyway at the World's Fair. Unlike other Disneyland rides such as the Monorail, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, or Autopia, in which the motors were arranged into the vehicles. Here, the motors to move the vehicles forward would be arranged into the track. The People Mover track would have hundreds of rotating tires. The spinning wheels would connect with a metal plate on the bottom side of each People Mover vehicle to advance the cars forward at roughly 7 miles per hour. This would create a slow-moving ride in which cars on an elevated track offered guests a scenic tour of New Tomorrowland. As part of this tour, guests riding about 16 feet above the general walkway would journey past Mary's murals, giving them a unique vantage point to enjoy her work. From the ground, guests would look up at her murals, which was a common way to view large pieces of public art, but from the People Mover, guests in slow-moving vehicles would glide past it, where they could observe the art straight on, which was typically how guests viewed art arranged in a museum. In the spring of 1967, Mary was still working to finalize her drawings, creating a full-sized image that would then guide production of the ceramic tiles. "I will make detailed sketches of the figures," she told Dick Irvine in March, to project and draw directly on the enlarged image. From there, she worked with Interpaste just as she had for the Jules Stein project. With assistance, she transferred her designs onto clay squares. Color was applied, but that color would deepen during the kilning process. From there, the tiles would be installed by craftspeople at the park, transforming Tomorrowland's previous vision of an industrial future into one that was now focused on Mary's art. These murals represented the largest presentation of Mary's work, a visual display as large or larger than a movie screen. Each was roughly 54 feet long and over 15 feet high. In reviewing her finished work, she again thought of them in relationship to her early work with watercolors. "The production of the mural in this manner creates an impression of wet watercolors," she said, "with their richness and glistening qualities. The effect is permanent, of course, because the tiles will not fade." From Mary's perspective, the installation of her art at Disneyland may have had one downside. In the art world, at least in 1967, having work exhibited at Disneyland did not carry the same level of prestige as having work exhibited at one of America's best-known museums, such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But Disneyland did have its own advantages. In the year following the mural's installation, Disneyland would receive over 9 million visitors, most of whom would see the murals, even if it was only a casual observation. The park would also make and sell postcards that featured her work. In contrast, for the same year, the Museum of Modern Art in New York would receive less than 900,000 visitors. Using only the metric of public exposure to art, Mary's murals might have been seen as more successful or influential than similar works of art displayed elsewhere in the United States, simply as many millions more people would have seen them in Tomorrowland. Without Walt, the Disney Company struggled to find successful ways to premiere new attractions and new lands, as previously Walt had presided over these ceremonies at his park. The first post-Walt attraction to open was Pirates of the Caribbean. For this, Disney arranged a themed opening in which cast members dressed as 18th century pirates and sailors took over the sailing ship Columbia and then boisterously stormed their way over to the new attraction, where they overtook guards and then, using a wooden beam, battered open the doors to the attraction, thereby opening it to the public. For New Tomorrowland, Disney wanted a more elegant ceremony, similar to those Walt had once hosted. For this, they asked the 1967 Disneyland ambassador, Marcia Miner, to serve as host. Miner was a slender girl with dark hair arranged into a pixie crop, who, like previous ambassadors, was a goodwill spokesperson for both the park and for other Disney events. On July 2nd, at the entrance to New Tomorrowland, she stood on a temporary platform beside Mickey Mouse to officially open this new area. She was joined by executives representing companies that sponsored individual attractions. Among them were executives from those companies with whom Mary had worked. Missing from the list of main presenters, though, was Walt's older brother, Roy. The presentation was festive and professional, but also it lacked the appeal and gravitas of those events personally hosted by Walt. Inside the company, the problems with this presentation were clear. A creative, family-centered company like Walt Disney Productions needed a single person to not only discuss the company's vision, but also to represent the values embraced by the company for years. For a park that had been advertised as one man's vision, it was unusual to see a committee of business professionals and a park ambassador standing in for Walt. Roy, too, understood the issue. With no seasoned executive to lead, he would need to forego retirement and step in as CEO, a new role that essentially consolidated the previous roles held by both himself and his brother into a single executive position. This then left open the question about how, if at all, they should proceed with Florida. As with New Tomorrowland finished, WED managers wanted to know how to plan out the next year or two. During these same weeks as New Tomorrowland was being finished and opened, Roy talked with Dick Irvine and other creative leads at WED, explaining that a new managerial burden would fall on them if the company moved forward with Florida. Under Walt, each creative division of the company had been closely supervised and given detailed feedback by Walt himself. Under Roy, creative divisions would need to self-manage, revising work in a manner consistent with Walt's goals, even though Walt was no longer with them. This would be particularly true for WED, as of all the Disney divisions, Roy had had the least exposure to their work and traditions. Once Roy and key managers such as Dick Irvine agreed on a path forward with Florida, Roy took his message to WED employees. As artist Blaine Gibson recalled, Roy got up on stage and he said, "We're going to go ahead and we're going to start our first project at Disney World." WED writer Marty Sklar explained that he himself was personally compelled to pursue the Florida project. "I knew I had to build that park," he said. "I wouldn't dare face Walt after I died not having had that park." Roy also met with Disneyland managers including Dick Nunis, who oversaw park operations. He asked Nunis and other managers the same question. "Can we do this without Walt?" Everyone, according to Nunis, said mostly the same thing. "We don't know, but we ought to try." Walt's death changed the Florida project in certain ways. Walt had envisioned deeply themed resort hotels around the new theme park, such as a Western hotel and a hotel focused on colonial life in America, essentially a hotel themed to Liberty Square. Most of these themed hotels, except for the one focused on Polynesian islands, would never be built. Walt had also envisioned both a futuristic city as well as an industrial park where companies would develop products for the near future in lab areas the public might visit. This, too, was never built. Lastly, Walt envisioned a theme park that would include many new rides whose theming was different from those at Disneyland. With a few exceptions such as Liberty Square and the Mickey Mouse Revue, these too were never built as WED moved back to designs and layouts that were more familiar to them as they were based on Disneyland. In terms of practical elements that affected individual artists at WED, Walt's death caused an 8 to 9 month pause in development on the Florida project. a pause that would have ripple effects for the next 2 or 3 years. In the year after Walt died, Marty Sklar explained, many people were extremely frustrated because we had already started on Walt Disney World. We were well into it by that time, and we didn't make any progress for a good year after Walt died. For Mary, Walt's death had practical consequences in terms of her career. If Walt had lived, Mary almost surely would have been moved from New Tomorrowland over to the Florida project rather quickly. If there was a gap, Walt almost surely would have given her some other assignment until she was needed on the project that later would be called Walt Disney World. But after all that had recently happened, she could easily see the future. Disney would need to focus on land prep and site design in Florida before they shifted back to designing the resort and its attractions. Mary would now have a year, more likely 2, before her next project with Disney. This left her free to focus on her family, which was where a new set of problems was beginning to unfold. In the fall of 1967, Mary's older son Donovan was heading off to college to study art. He went to the Tyler School of the Arts, which was part of Temple University. At this point in the school's history, Temple had recently become a state-related public university with a growing number of students. The main campus in Philadelphia served over 20,000 full and part-time students, which might have been a threatening environment for Donovan, who was somewhat reserved and often kept to himself. But the School of Arts was located about 7 miles from the main campus, arranged onto an estate that had been donated to the university. Though Chenard had been located in an urban section of Los Angeles not far from MacArthur Park, the compact arrangement of the Tyler School, situated on an estate, would have reminded Mary and Lee of their own time decades earlier in art school. The Tyler School, like Chenard, offered classes on drawing, painting, sculpture, and other fine arts, with all of the classrooms arranged into a single building. But unlike Chenard, the Tyler School did not have a strong secondary focus in the commercial arts, such as illustration and drawing as it was related to film. But the Tyler School did have this one large advantage. It was only a 2-hour drive from the Blair's home in Great Neck, New York. It was far enough for Donovan to experience independence, but not so far that Mary and Lee couldn't intervene if he had problems there. With Donovan in college and Kevin still moving through high school, Mary had a little time to focus on herself. She knew that she would likely have a role on the Disney project in Florida, but as Roy had delayed moving forward with these plans, she likely wouldn't see an assignment until the park and resort areas were fully laid out. During this year, Mary returned to Europe where she spent time with her friend Retta Scott. But the real problems were again developing back home. Donovan didn't adjust well to living without family in Philadelphia. Friends of the family repeatedly pointed out that in many subjects, Donovan could be slow to pick up key concepts such as in math or science. He occasionally struggled with simply taking care of himself and managing social situations, but he excelled in art. By the summer of 1968, Mary and Lee knew that Donovan was having problems, though they didn't know the extent of them. They likely assumed that some drug experimentation was part of the young adult experience, same as alcohol had been for both of them back at Chenard. But Donovan's encounters with drugs were more significant than most realized. He had made friends who introduced him to LSD. About his experience at Temple University, Donovan later said, "Yeah, I went there for 3 semesters, went to freshman and sophomore. It was a 4-year school. It was a little too hard for me." Donovan created many engaging paintings, some of which were eventually hung in the Blair's house alongside those by Lee and Mary. By December, Lee and Mary could see the writing on the wall that living on his own was doing more harm to Donovan than good. One family friend put it bluntly that Donovan crashed and burned at Temple. That Christmas, the Blairs drove down to Philadelphia to bring him and his things home for good. They sensed that Donovan needed the protection and comfort of their home, a safe place where he might mature more slowly into adulthood. But they also didn't want to give up on his education, so they enrolled him in a local art school that he could commute to from home. This would be a fresh start, a way for Donovan to explore his art with the support and supervision of his parents. "I went to School of Visual Arts on 23rd Street, Donovan explained. A 9-story building. I went there maybe 2 years. I don't know, 68, 69, somewhere around there." The School of Visual Arts, or SVA as it was known locally, was a much smaller school than Temple, with about 1,000 full and part-time students. Beyond size, it differed from Temple in that, along with the fine arts, it offered many classes in commercial arts, such as advertising illustration, editorial illustration, cartooning, character design, animation, and illustration for children's books. In essence, these were all areas in which Lee and Mary had become industry experts over the previous 3 decades. The school also employed a few near-celebrity instructors, including Edward Gorey, who was then widely known for his Gothic-influenced pen and ink drawings widely featured in magazines and children's books. With this new plan, at least for a while, the Blair family reached a delicate stasis. Mary remained between projects, though surely she would soon receive a call from Disney. Lee, still drinking, struggled to keep his company going, though the size of it remained overwhelming for him. Donovan commuted the 26 miles by rail to SVA most days, though living so far from campus remained an issue for him. And Kevin was finishing up high school with a goal of studying engineering after he graduated. Some of the family's best days still involved their sailboat, all of them often with a friend or two gliding over the water. There were good days during these years. The peace almost surely felt like a reprieve to everyone in the family, but also they likely sensed that larger problems rested just beneath the surface, problems that would likely bubble up again. The plan right now is to return next week with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.